don't we have more games about mechs? Like seriously, maybe it's just my love for giant pilotable robots and anime talking, but I've never understood why we don't get more games about you, the player, in a mech. I mean, think about it. From a gameplay perspective, I feel like there's so much you can do with that. The amount of variety for combat, the potentially really interesting setting and stories, it'd be great! Which is a big part of the reason why today I'd like to talk about a more recent game in this, subgenre, I guess you could call it, Daemon X Machina. Originally released as a Switch exclusive in 2019, Daemon X Machina was the work of Marvelous and produced by Kenichiro Sukada, who worked on FromSoft's Armored Core series. The game released to mixed reviews across the board, with a lot of people really liking it, but just as many being a bit more lukewarm. From what I've heard though, this is kind of the norm for games like this, so that's not really too indicative of the game's actual quality. Honestly, I've been looking forward to actually getting around to playing this game, because it does look pretty fun, and as I've said before, I love mechs. For this review, I'll be looking at the Steam version of Daemon X Machina though. Not because it runs better, I don't personally care too much about that, but because it's strangely $10 cheaper than the Switch version, and this channel's got a pretty tiny budget. I need to cut costs where I can here, folks. Without further ado though, let's get this review started. I promised a little while ago I'd look at this game, so it's time I finally kept that promise. The story of Daemon X Machina starts sometime after the Moonfall, an apocalyptic event where a massive chunk of the moon crash-landed onto Earth. This not only caused about as much physical damage to the planet as you'd expect, but it also released femtoparticles, a substance that's both an incredible energy source and lethal to nearly anything with a pulse. Sometime after this event, humanity set up the Oval Link, a massive barrier that contains the femtoparticles where the three consortiums research and harvest them for practical purposes. This is where you, the player, come in. You play the role of an Outer, a special mercenary who works for a group called Orbital that's adapted to femto and gained special abilities from it. As an Outer, your job is to help the three consortiums and Orbital with whatever problems arise using a special mech called an Arsenal to fight enemy AI. You see, for unknown reasons, a strange force has been corrupting machinery and their AI into immortals, robots who for some reason have it out for humanity. The first half of the game is a pretty slow burn. It's gonna be a while before you fully understand why certain things are happening, which normally would be a perfectly fine way to tell a story if it wasn't for the last half. Without spoilers here, after the halfway point, Daemon X Machina's pacing ramps up really fast. Like it moves a couple miles a minute fast. Something in the story happened, and it's kind of a crapshoot whether someone will fully explain why or not. An answer seemingly exists, but the story just doesn't have the time to explain, and in a lot of cases, it can't even fully flesh out a number of characters because of this. Don't get me wrong, there were plenty of guys here I really enjoyed, like Johnny G and all of Team Innocence, but it feels like the game was trying to do way too much with way too little time, because this game can easily be beaten in around 15 hours. On a bit of a side note, I also don't like how cutscenes are presented most of the time. About 70% of all cutscenes take place with character windows on a gray backdrop, which is pretty boring. It honestly makes me feel like the game was made on a smaller budget than the devs wanted. Despite that though, I do genuinely feel like there's a good story here. It just needed more time to tell it, because on a purely narrative level, this game feels too short for its own good. Thankfully though, Daemon X Machina's gameplay makes up for some of this in my opinion, because both the Arsenal combat and the game's core loop is clearly the star of the show here. Daemon X Machina's gameplay is mission-based in its structure, with you tackling the offer missions, free missions, and even multiplayer missions, which we'll touch on later. Offer missions are this game's story, with them being sorted into ranks E through A. Free missions are structured just like the former, but unlike those, free missions can be repeated as many times as you want. During either, you'll be in control of your fully customizable arsenal to fight back against the Immortals, and let me just say, I absolutely love this thing. First off, it controls beautifully. Movement on both the land and in the air is perfect and feels very good. The only thing that took me a bit to get used to was the auto-aim. Instead of just having an aiming reticle, your arsenal auto-aims at whatever target the camera is focusing on. It was a bit weird at first because I wasn't used to this sort of thing, but after a couple missions it felt pretty natural. Secondly, I love how customizable it is, and how much variety there is in how you can play the game because of that. Aesthetically speaking, you can change everything about the arsenal except the lights. Mechanically speaking though, you have a wide variety of different parts and weapons you can equip. The arsenal's different parts each provide different overall stats, and while I could be wrong, there doesn't seem to be one objectively best set of parts. You'll use different ones depending on your playstyle. This greatly extends to your weaponry as well, with there being a grand total of 6 different weapons you can equip to your arsenal. You have 2 main weapons and 2 backups to swap between, a shoulder-mounted weapon, and even an auxiliary weapon for extra support. Honestly, it's kind of impressive just how diverse the overall weapon variety is. I myself mostly stuck to a few different weapon types, but as I went through the game, I noticed more and more just how many ways you can build your arsenal. For my main weapons, I stuck to dual-wielding assault rifles, but by the end of the game, I fell in love with also dual-wielding melee weapons, thanks to how hard they can hit. Of the shoulder weapons, I gotta say, I think the laser cannon is my favorite. It's pretty fun and even satisfying to use against giant immortals. You can get new weapons and even arsenal parts in 2 major ways. The simplest way is by looting enemy arsenals. Whenever you defeat one, they'll have a few different parts and weapons on them, with you being able to loot the one you fancy the most. This is a big part of Daemon X Machina's gameplay loop. By repeating missions, you'll be continuously looting arsenals for new parts that can also come with special mods for buffs and even extra mod slots for more powerful equipment. As a fan of Monster Hunter, this core loop scratches a pretty similar itch for me, because even if I don't end up using whatever part I get, it's still fun to grab it because frankly, I like getting stuff. It's very satisfying. The second method is by going to the factory and making new weapons and parts by providing the right amount of money and whatever part is needed. Whenever you make one, you'll then be able to buy extras in the shop for a hefty price if needed. While you're at base, you can also eat some ice cream for temporary buffs so minor I forgot it existed half the time, and you can even buff your player character, which is something I'm a bit mixed on. On a purely mechanical level, there's nothing really wrong here. There are 3 skill trees in total: your head, upper, and lower body. These can buff your arsenal and even your outer themselves when they're on the ground, but you'll almost never have to worry about that last one. The problem is that it actually changes how your character looks over time. On paper, this is a fine enough concept, but it gets kinda ugly after a bit, and even a bit weird looking. I enjoy the idea behind it, but it does make me wonder what the point in letting me design my own character was if upgrades just cover them up. Like, at least let me take the helmet off. The cyber eyes look kinda pretty, so I'd at least be fine with seeing those. By the way, completely unrelated, but why can't I pet the dog? Look at the little guy. This is a pupper in desperate need of pets, and frankly, I'm appalled that I can't give him any. Shame on you, Daemon X Machina. Getting back to the missions though, you'll usually just be fighting immortals of some kind, may they be normal enemies or bosses, but sometimes you'll be defending certain structures from damage, gathering data, and so on and so forth. The only real issue I have with missions though is the variety of basic enemies present. All of the smaller immortals are purposefully really easy to deal with. Aside from serving as a simple obstacle, they also exist to give you, the player, resource drops if needed. In this regard, the smaller enemies do their job perfectly as hostile resource crates with military-grade weaponry, but it can get a bit boring after a while. Beyond them, we only have enemy arsenals to deal with, and let me tell ya, unless it's a boss arsenal, they ain't too exciting aside from their loot. The boss immortals, though, are far more interesting to deal with, and were by far my favorite missions in the game. There's not quite as many as I'd like, but these were always a joy to encounter. They were all big and imposing with really varied designs and fights. Even the game's first and easiest boss, Gunfort, was really cool. My favorite of them without spoilers, though, has to be Bolt, this flying battleship the Immortals converted into a sort of Eastern dragon. You can also grind these bosses in free missions to get mods as well as blueprints and special items needed to make boss equipment. I can't speak for how useful most of them are since I wasn't super interested in most of them, but Rebellion's arm parts were pretty good from my experience. In the game's multiplayer missions, you'll also be able to fight 3 different stronger versions for each of the game's bosses, and let me tell ya, the final Omega versions can get pretty hard. Gunfort's alpha and beta versions aren't too bad, but the Omega version's a pretty rough fight. Aside from hitting really hard, it also emits a lot of heat, which drains your arsenal's stamina. If that hits 0 while you're flying, you'll fall to the ground, and you'll have to wait until it fills to go into the air again or even boost. There's also a bunch of multiplayer-only bosses you can fight, and these can get pretty crazy. I only got a 10th of the way through their health bar before I died. They certainly are not meant to be fought without help or a really strong build. As a quick tip for these harder fights, make sure to get the upgrade that lets you use Blink on the skill tree. The ability in question lets you teleport a set distance in whatever direction you double-tap the analog stick. It's an excellent evasion-based ability and will make dealing with these Immortals' attacks a lot easier. Daemon X Machina's story may fall a bit short, but as a game, it's pretty well made. The core gameplay loop is satisfying, and the mech combat is really fun and feels perfect. Honestly, this first playthrough has me really excited for the game's sequel, which by this point has been in development for at least 3 years now. If they could improve on what the game did right while fixing the game's problems, such as the length of its main story and pacing, I think we'll be in for something really special. With that being said though, thank you all for watching, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I hope you all have a nice day.